The room smelled of burning metal and blood. Captain David Carter sat slumped in the cold steel chair, his wrists bound by shimmering energy cuffs. His face was bruised, a thin cut over his brow still bleeding sluggishly. The low hum of alien machinery filled the dimly lit interrogation chamber. Across from him stood Commander Zalzor, a towering reptilian warlord with dark emerald scales and piercing yellow eyes. Behind him, two more of his kind, hulking brutes in black combat armor, watched with predatory amusement. Zalzor smirked, arms folded behind his back. "You humans, so fragile, so soft." His voice was thick with contempt. "And yet, you insist on fighting wars you cannot win." David exhaled slowly, flexing his fingers against the cuffs. The energy stung, but he ignored it. He tilted his head, giving the commander a lazy smile. "Yeah? You sure about that?" The two guards exchanged a glance before breaking into laughter, a deep, guttural sound. One of them, Vortak, stepped forward, flexing clawed fingers. "You are nothing, human. Weak, pathetic. You don't belong in the stars." David met his gaze, unflinching. "Funny. That's exactly what we said about bacteria once. Then they adapted, became stronger, took over." He smirked. "Sound familiar?" The laughter faded. Zalzor's eyes narrowed. David leaned back. "Look, I get it. You see us as inferior, easy prey. But there's something you don't understand." Zalzor clicked his tongue, stepping closer. "And what is that, human?" David grinned, showing bloody teeth. "Never corner a wounded animal." The ship's alarms suddenly blared, flashing red across the walls. Zalzor snapped his head toward the control panel. The brutes tensed. David just smiled wider. Took them long enough. The energy cuffs burned against David's wrists, but he barely flinched. Pain was temporary. Commander Zalzor paced before him, his clawed hands clasped behind his back. "Your kind is stubborn," he muttered. "I'll never understand why you fight wars you cannot win." David exhaled sharply. "Because losing isn't in our vocabulary." He met the alien's gaze, his voice calm, steady. "We either win, or we make sure no one else does." Zalzor's jaw tightened. He leaned in, yellow eyes burning into David's. "Your fleet is outmatched. Your planet is defenseless. Yet you refuse to surrender." He tilted his head. "Why?" David smirked. "You wouldn't get it." The commander's lips curled. "Oh, but I will." He gestured, and one of his guards, a brute named Vortak, stepped forward. The alien's scaled fist crashed into David's gut. Pain exploded through him, but he only let out a slow breath. Zalzor crouched beside him. "Your people are insects, scurrying in the dirt. If you tell me where your fleet is hiding, I'll be merciful." David coughed, but chuckled. "Mercy? That what you told the last colony you burned?" He licked the blood from his lip. "I saw the footage. Women. Kids. You don't do mercy." Zalzor sighed, as if disappointed. "Very well." He turned to his guards. "Break him!" Vortak stepped forward again. David lifted his head, his bruised face splitting into a bloody grin. "Before you do that, you might want to check your ship's reactor core." The alarms blared. Zalzor's eyes snapped toward the control panel. The overhead lights flickered. A voice crackled through the intercom, frantic. "Commander! Security breach! Engineering deck compromised!" David chuckled, rolling his shoulders. "Took them long enough." Zalzor spun back to him, eyes wide with rage. "What have you done?" David leaned forward, his voice a whisper. "You should have killed me when you had the chance." Vortak leaned down, his reptilian snout inches from David's face. His breath reeked of raw meat. "What will you do, tiny human?" He flexed his claws, each one the length of a dagger. Break free? Punch me? A deep, rumbling laugh rolled from his throat. Your kind is weak. David sighed. You really don't get it, do you? Commander Zalzor smirked and waved a hand. A holographic display flickered to life in the air. It showed wreckage, twisted metal, shattered ships, drifting bodies, the remains of Earth's fleet. Your resistance is futile, Zalzor said, his voice smooth with satisfaction. Your species is doomed. The other officers chuckled, their laughter a mixture of hissing and clicking. Vortak sneered. Such short lives, so fragile, so easy to break. David's expression never changed. He let them laugh, let them mock, let them think they'd won, because he knew something they didn't. A sharp beep cut through the air. Zalzor frowned. His yellow eyes flicked toward the holo display. A red warning flashed across the screen. Unauthorized access detected. David's grin widened. Took them long enough? The alarms howled through the ship. The overhead lights flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. Zalzor whipped around. Report! A panicked voice crackled over the intercom. Commander, we have a breach. Engineering deck compromised. The laughter stopped. Vortak snarled, grabbing David's jumpsuit. What did you do? David chuckled. Not me, us. The ship shook violently. The floor trembled beneath them. Then, for the first time, David saw something in the alien's eyes that he hadn't before. Fear. David exhaled slowly, the tight restraints digging into his arms. The alien warship's interrogation chamber was dimly lit, the overhead lights flickering with each distant tremor. Outside, the battle was over, or so they thought. Across from him, Commander Zalzor watched with a smirk, his deep blue skin glistening under the dim glow of the consoles. Vortak, his towering enforcer, cracked his knuckles, each pop echoing in the cold silence. The aliens had laughed at him minutes ago. Now, they were waiting, watching. David leaned forward as far as his restraints allowed, voice calm but cold. You know, there's a saying on Earth. Zalzor scoffed. And what wisdom do your fragile people have to offer? David smirked. Never corner a wounded animal. A pause. The room suddenly felt heavier. The laughter from earlier was gone. Zalzor tilted his head. And why is that? David's grin widened. Because that's when it's most dangerous. The ship lurched, throwing loose objects from the control panels. The overhead lights flickered harder, buzzing as if uncertain whether to stay on. A sharp beep cut through the air. A red holographic alert flared to life. Warning! Unauthorized system breach. Zalzor's smirk vanished. What? A panicked voice crackled over the intercom. Commander, we have a breach. Engineering deck compromised. The tension snapped like a taut wire. Vortak's snarl deepened, his massive frame turning toward David. What did you do? David chuckled. Not me. Us. Zalzor whirled toward the holo display. Security feeds flickered in and out. Then came the images. Human soldiers, battered but alive, moving like ghosts through the corridors. They worked fast, using the ship's own systems against it. Impossible, Zalzor hissed. Your fleet was destroyed. David's eyes glinted. You don't understand humans, do you? The warship trembled violently. A distant explosion rocked the walls. Zalzor barked an order in his native tongue, but the ship lurched again, cutting him off. David leaned back against his restraints, calm amid the chaos. You assumed we'd fight like you, that we'd break when outnumbered. A deafening boom rang through the chamber. Smoke hissed from the control panels. Sparks rained down like fireflies. David looked up. But we don't break. Another explosion, The door locks disengaged with a metallic hiss. Footsteps thundered outside. David smiled. Right on time. David sat strapped to the cold metal chair, wrists bound in thick restraints. The air smelled of ozone and alien machinery, the hum of the warship's engines vibrating beneath his feet. Across from him stood Commander Zalzor, the alien warlord who had spent the last hour mocking humanity's final defeat. The deep blue-skinned creature exhaled through his slitted nostrils, his mandibles clicking in amusement. "You humans," Zalzor mused, "always so stubborn, even when beaten." David met his gaze, his expression unreadable. Then he smirked. "There's a lesson about us you haven't learned yet." Zalzor scoffed. "Oh? And what lesson is that?" David's grin widened, but he said nothing. Then the ship lurched. A distant explosion sent a tremor through the deck. The lights overhead flickered, casting the room in shifting shadows. Zalzor's eyes narrowed. "What was that?" David leaned back as far as his restraints allowed. "Your first warning." The ship shuddered again, harder this time. The intercom crackled to life, panic in the alien officer's voice. "Commander, we have—" Static. Then another voice. "This one human. Bridge secured. Engine room compromised. You're losing this ship." Zalzor spun toward the holodisplay. Security feeds flickered with static, but the images were clear enough. Humans moving through the corridors like phantoms, taking down his forces with precision. They were supposed to be extinct. Vortak, his brutish second-in-command, clenched his fists. "Impossible. Their fleet was annihilated." David chuckled. "Funny thing about us. We don't stay dead when you expect us to." Zalzor snarled. "Your forces are outnumbered. What can a few stragglers possibly accomplish?" David's smile didn't fade. "You'll see." Another explosion rocked the ship. The deck tilted, sending tools and loose objects tumbling. Smoke poured from vents. Emergency klaxons blared in deep, throbbing tones. The ship was dying. Zalzor slammed his fist against the console. How? You couldn't have known we were coming." David exhaled, almost disappointed. "You really don't get it, do you?" The room plunged into darkness. Emergency lights flickered on, painting everything in deep red. Zalzor turned to his guards. "Secure the ship! Wipe them out!" Silence. His guards were gone. The doors to the interrogation chamber stood slightly ajar, as if inviting him to run. David flexed his wrists. His restraints snapped open. Zalzor took an involuntary step back. "How?" David stood slowly, rolling his shoulders. His silhouette, cast in blood-red light, looked almost predatory. "You assumed we were weak, because we lacked fangs," David said, stepping forward. "Because we weren't born with claws." Another explosion thundered through the ship. Through the viewport, Zalzor saw something that made his blood run cold. Human warships. They had decloaked all around them. A fleet. Small, battered, but alive. Zalzor's confidence shattered. "No, that's not possible. We left nothing behind." David tilted his head. "You didn't leave survivors. You left witnesses. And we watched. We learned." Zalzor's mandibles twitched. "This is a suicide run." David's smile was razor-sharp. "Number this is an execution." The comms crackled to life again. A new voice, calm and assured. "David, we have control. Ready for final strike?" David's gaze never left Zalzor's. "Do it!" A final detonation rocked the ship. Then the stars outside shifted. The enemy fleet was gone. And humanity? Humanity had just begun. The restraints fell away with a hiss. David rubbed his wrists, stepping forward as Zalzor instinctively recoiled. The alien warlord, always so sure of his dominance, now looked uncertain. You think strength is about muscle, numbers, or tech, David said, his voice calm but edged with something sharper. But strength is something else entirely. Zalzor's mandibles twitched. Enlighten me, human. What is strength? David took another step, adapting, never giving up, turning defeat into victory. He gestured to the war-torn battlefield outside the viewport. You think we lost? That humanity is gone? He chuckled. It wasn't a pleasant sound. We were never fighting the same war you were. You came here expecting submission, thinking we'd break like every other species you've conquered. But humans don't break. We endure. Zalzor sneered, trying to regain control of the conversation. Your species is reckless. Your world burned because you refused to surrender. David's expression darkened. Our world burned because we let you believe we were weak. He met the alien's gaze, unflinching. You don't understand real suffering. Your kind has never lost a war, never had to rebuild from ash. Every civilization you crushed made you softer. Zalzor's grip tightened on the hilt of his ceremonial blade. We have crushed thousands of species. We will crush yours, David grinned. Number you won't. The ship lurched violently. The floor tilted. Sparks rained from overhead panels. The alarms that had been blaring for minutes now took on a new, desperate tone. Zalzor turned toward the holodisplay. His fleet, his entire fleet, was disappearing from the system, consumed by fire and fury. David's voice was quiet but firm. You invaded our world thinking we'd fall like all the rest. But we don't fall. We learn. We adapt. And now? The warlord turned back just in time to see David raising a stolen plasma rifle. Now, we teach. The ship exploded into fire and chaos. The restraints hissed open. David flexed his fingers, feeling the numbness fade. Across the dimly lit chamber, Zalzor took a step back. The warlord had mocked him for hours. But now? Now, there was fear in his eyes. David rolled his shoulders and stepped forward. You think this is over? His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. Zalzor scoffed, forcing a sneer. You are one man, human. My fleet surrounds your dying world. What can you possibly do? David chuckled, low and cold. Your mistake wasn't underestimating me. It was underestimating all of us. Before Zalzor could respond, the ship lurched violently. The overhead lights flickered. Alarms blared. A panicked alien officer stumbled into the room. Supreme Warlord, the human fleet, they... A distant explosion cut him off. Zalzor turned to the holodisplay. The screen showed the impossible. His fleet, his entire fleet, was shutting down. Massive EMP detonations had left his warships drifting, powerless. His species had never needed safeguards against such an attack. No enemy had ever fought them this way. David tilted his head, watching the realization dawn on the warlord. You came here expecting a war of strength. But humans? He smirked. We fight wars of survival. The ship shuddered again. The restraints meant to hold David lost power entirely, their locking mechanisms failing. Zalzor took a step back. Kill him! Vortak, the massive alien guard, lunged. David moved first. He ducked low, dodging the alien's massive arms. His fist shot up, slamming into Vortak's throat. The alien staggered, choking. David didn't stop. He grabbed a fallen rifle, swung it like a club, and cracked it against Vortak's skull. The guard collapsed. Zalzor stared in disbelief. You weren't afraid, he whispered. David wiped blood from his knuckles and smiled darkly. Number I was waiting. Outside, the human fleet moved in, reclaiming the skies. The war wasn't over, but the lesson had begun. The cell was quiet. Too quiet. David sat on the cold metal floor, wrists bound in thick alien restraints. His muscles ached from the beating. His mind burned with the memory of Earth, his home, burning in the sky. Across the room, Supreme Commander Zalzor watched him with an amused expression. The warlord's jagged exoskeleton glistened under the dim lights, his 6 eyes filled with contempt. "You humans are a curious species," Zalzor said, his voice thick with mockery. "You fight like cornered animals, but you lack the strength to win." David smirked. "Then why are you afraid?" Zalzor stiffened, mandibles clicking. "I do not fear you." "Then why haven't you killed me?" The warlord's expression darkened. He turned away, watching the holographic display that showed his fleet, thousands of warships orbiting a dying Earth. "We have crushed every species before you," Zalzor said. "Yours is no different." David leaned forward, ignoring the pain in his ribs. "That's where you're wrong." The lights flickered. A deep rumble vibrated through the ship. Zalzor turned sharply. "Report!" A nearby officer, his dark exoskeleton slick with fear, hesitated before speaking. "Supreme One, we are under attack." "Impossible," Zalzor roared. "No human ships remain." The officer swallowed hard. "Not ships, Supreme One. Something else." The lights flickered again. David smiled. "Right on time." Aboard the Human Resistance command ship, Captain Reyes stood at the bridge, watching the battlefield unfold. The last of Earth's fleet had been destroyed weeks ago. The aliens thought they had won. They hadn't. "Status?" Reyes asked. "Phase 1 complete," his officer replied. "The virus is in their systems. They don't know it yet." Reyes nodded. "Then let's remind them who we are." Back on Zalzor's ship. The alarms blared. Zalzor turned toward David, rage boiling in his eyes. "What have you done?" David shrugged. "You think humans need warships to win? We fight with our minds." Across the alien fleet, systems shut down. Engines failed. Weapons locked. Shields flickered and collapsed. "We don't just fight battles," David continued. "We fight wars of survival." Zalzor grabbed David by the throat, lifting him off the ground. "You are nothing!" he snarled. David coughed, but grinned through the pain. "Then why are your ships falling from the sky?" The warlord turned to the holodisplay. One by one, his warships drifted, powerless. Human forces, small, fast, relentless, descended from hidden bases on Earth's moon, boarding alien vessels, taking them over. It wasn't brute strength. It wasn't superior numbers. It was strategy. It was adaptation. It was humanity refusing to die. The final stand. Zalzor's grip loosened. This is impossible." David coughed, stepping forward as the restraints fell from his wrists. This is human history." Zalzor turned to his officers. "Fire everything!" Silence. The officers didn't move. Their screens were dead, their weapons offline, their fleet crippled. A voice echoed through the ship's speakers. "Captain Reyes, this is humanity. We do not seek war, but if you bring it to us, we will make sure you never forget us." Zalzor staggered back. David leaned in. "Next time, don't laugh at a human. You might not live long enough to regret it." He walked past the defeated warlord, stepping over the fallen alien guards. The airlock hissed open. A human transport waited. David turned one last time. Never corner a wounded animal. The doors closed. The battle was over. And humanity? Humanity had just begun.